Thanks for coming. I genuinely appreciate it. I wrote a bunch of fantasy world building stories with different characters, plots, and struggles, and I figured I'd put it up on YouTube with some art and music and kind of see what happens. If you're coming to this channel, this is the second story in the series. It's a three-parter. This is part one, the title of which is The Long March of the Clearwater Spears. It is about a mercenary army commissioned to support a failing nation against a rising warlord. The only problem is that that failing nation is hundreds of leagues away, and the mercenary army has to march across this great swath of land in a very short period of time in order to provide that necessary support. It's got, a lot of different interesting, unique characters, and it's going to focus a little bit on not just, the fighting or anything like that, but also the struggles that come with a long, hard, forced march, and they are very, very real. And I hope you enjoy. If you're curious about the artists, stick around to the end, and I'll tell you a little bit about them and where you can find them. And if you like this content, please like, comment, subscribe. That's the only way that's going to really grow my channel and get my name out there, and I would, genuinely appreciate that sort of thing. And to that end, and without further ado, hope you enjoy the story.
Unification had always been something whispered about, a fine notion filled with a long list of benefits. The only problem was every patronage felt that their needs came first, and no one was big enough to force their will on everyone else. 2 or 4 of the 14 patronages were always allied at one time or another, but in Lano and Taurus's lifetime, they never lasted. Periods of peace changed with the seasons, back and forth like the east and west winds. It was what made the mercenary business so good. Then the devastating host of the Scorched Imperator came from the northwest. And while other nations stood fixated by old grudges, the matron Seraphina sought to raise her own armies to stop them. The watchtower sentry had spied her banner at 1 league away. The matron Seraphina was traveling light, 7 horses and only 6 knights deep. She was the type of person who called you into her presence, and not the other way around. By the size of her party, she was trying to move with as much speed as possible. Those were 2 tells for Lano that some very bad news was coming his way. Of course, bad news almost always meant a good wage for his troops. He was waiting for her just within the gates of his hilltop fort. As she briskly dismounted, he led her up to his quarters. Practically the moment the thick wooden door closed behind the 2 of them, the negotiations began. "Tea?" he offered, gesturing towards a steel kettle hung over his fireplace. "I'm fine where I stand," she replied curtly. The matron Seraphina stood with muddied riding chaps and furs. Her wind-swept golden hair stuck to her forehead, where the sweat had locked with it. The intense blue of her eyes carried with it a high degree of smoldering fire. There was aggression in her tall stance, but the frayed edges of something else showed in her face that awakened the mercenary leader's attention. Fatigue and fear. The mercenary marshal had nodded, leaving the water bubbling as he took a careful seat in his chair before the richest royal east of the Gatacanis River. "How many soldiers can you field, Marshal?" she began. Straight to business. That was a 3rd tell. The price was going up in his head. Still, he lied, as it was never smart to give that kind of information away freely. "I have 1,200 here at the fort." She scoffed at the answer. "I've also heard about the 2,000 you mustered for Teleran and its battle with the Crescent." Her knowledge was a mild surprise to Lano, but only a mild one. Not enough to evoke an emotional response from him. Showing weakness hurt his leverage when it came to these transactions. The best pay for his soldiers meant he had one of the most talented mercenary armies in the East, and he had every intention of keeping it that way. His gaze met hers levelly, and he told the truth. I can raise a total of 2,500 spear, archer, and cavalry in 4 days. Make it 2 days, and I'll make it worth your while. Lano's brow furrowed in surprise for a brief moment. A fourth tell. Less than that. These weren't tells. She wasn't trying to hide anything. That struck the mercenary marshal as strange. He dealt with the matron Seraphina enough to know she was far from stupid. Why the call for numbers? And why with such urgency? He eyed the great royal before him with cautious intrigue. What are we discussing here? Have you heard of the rise of the warlord to the west of us? She asked. That statement gave the marshal of the Clearwater Spears a long pause. He had. It was almost impossible not to have. The demon of a warrior had conquered 5 of the 14 patronages, practically before anyone knew it was happening. Last he'd heard, this warlord had been halted at the border with Raver, among the bluffs west of the Gaticanis River. But that was over 250 leagues away, and there were 3 patronages between the fighting and them. Lano could sense where this was going, and the matron Seraphina's next words only served to confirm it. I need you to get to Raver before the fall rains begin, and remain until after the winter. I need you to bring war to this warlord, to this scorched imperator as he calls himself. Disbelief registered in Lano's face for a brief moment as he shifted in his chair. The fall rains were perhaps a month away. His army would have to keep pace of about 15 leagues a day to make the time. She was asking for the longest, hardest kind of march, into likely a harder battle. He stood silently in the shadows of his quarters, beside the great royal, as the incredible nature of her request coursed through his mind. I know you care more for coin than country, Marshal, she continued, but the pay will measure up against the demand. I promise it. He scoffed. By the highest will of rancor, that was absolutely the truth. But that wasn't going to be enough for him, nor his troops. He was going to need a good reason that would carry them through the exhausting days and the painfully short rests. Pay's a good place to start, he replied firmly. But I'm going to need more than that before I commit my troops. I'm going to need details. I'm going to need a good reason. She responded with a curt nod, her smoldering eyes matching the ice of his voice. Then we begin, she replied simply. He should have said no to the matron, but he didn't. It had certainly helped that in his few dealings with her before, she'd always paid her commitments without incident. Still, he knew the endeavor was crazy, but the argument appeared to be as honest as the pay, and he was doing it. He had brought his troops into this, and he was going to do everything in his power to get them there safely. He'd surveyed the maps, planned the routes, and acted. He had 3 lands to cover: the forests of the Crescent, the yellowed plains, loosely ruled by Karul, and the bluffs of the patronage of Raver. The long line of his troops marched along the closest thing that came to a main road heading west. They were 4 days out from their fort, and 6 days out from his meeting with the matron. The patronage of the Crescent was a world of old-growth trees. Many stood like ancient behemoths reaching out towards the sky. The nobility lived in the largest of them. It was the start of the fall season, and their leaves were beginning to turn above them. As the sun's light passed through them, it speckled the land below in hues of red, orange, and golden. It was almost as a rainbow that couldn't decide where it wished to land, and so fell everywhere. Someone other than Lano might have taken the time to call it beautiful. But his attention wasn't there. It was on the forest undergrowth and the occasional catwalks that ran between the larger of the trees. Between trunks, branches, and leaves, he caught the flashes of spears and bows, armor and soldiers. A detachment of the Crescent's army shadowed them as they headed west, but at least they weren't attacking. The mercenary leader eyed them warily from the perch of his horse. He cast ahead behind him at his troops to confirm that his archers were still protected on either side by the ranks of his heavy infantry. They were. Still, a sick unease rumbled in his chest. The force on either side of them were ideal for a trap, and his was a foreign army marching through a land they had recently fought. It could all turn bad very quickly. He turned to the approaching hoofbeats of his second horse, returning from a round. Hannah rode up alongside him in rustling chainmail that covered her broad and muscular frame. Strands of unruly short auburn hair stretched down across her plain, scarred face. She was a brute of a woman, but a woman nonetheless. She matched pace with the mercenary leader, the familiar smirk showing under the cover of a thin-brimmed steel helmet. "We're shadowed on practically all sides," she informed him. "Numbers appear fewer than us, but enough to make some trouble. Looks like the matron did what she had to with the Crescent to get them in line." Caution still rumbled in his chest, but the confirmation was helpful to the edges of it. "I wonder what she traded for that to happen," he said. "What do you mean?" His eyes rose to the great trees surrounding them. "The Crescent's strong. That was why Telleran paid us. It must have been something big, especially to shift so quickly." Hannah chuckled. "Probably traded a princess or two. Erudite knows how practical the matron is." Lano nodded as he shifted the conversation. "How are the troops faring in the back?" "Gnashing and moaning," she replied, "but also talking about all the things they're going to do with the windfall coming their way. So they're doing fine, then." Hannah shrugged. "As good as you can expect. I don't imagine it will prove with the distance, though. I don't look forward to the yellowed plains." "I'll do my rounds with them," Lano nodded as he gestured ahead of them. "There's a small river about 2 leagues up. Should be clear of the trees. We'll stop there briefly to water up and rest. Pass the word." "Aye, Marshal," she said, kicking her horse up to a canter and heading back down the line. He turned his head forward, his eyes on the road, his thoughts ever on the task before him. At steady gait his army marched behind him, all heading westward. In time, Hannah returned to take her place beside Lano. The tall trees shrank back behind them as the sounds of running water rose into the air. In a small space further, a 20-stride wide river revealed itself, weaving through the hills and boulders. "Rest up! Watch up!" Hannah bellowed at the top of her lungs. The call went through the ranks. His forces drew up along the river's edge. Those few stuck with sentry duty cursed, but followed their orders. They hefted shield and spear as they marched to the edges of the developing semicircle. The scouting horses took to the woods with horns in hand. Lano had his own tasks to take to before he got his water or his rest. There was one matter to be told the status of things, and a different one to see it for yourself. He turned his horse from the banks of running water, trotting through the mass of 2,500 soldiers, towards the gathering watchstanders. 2 of his lieutenants, Urja and Dennis, hailed him as he passed, raising their acknowledgement with the grunts. He returned those hails with a nod. The bits and pieces of heated conversation drifted into the air around him. Soldiers dumped packs with groans and sighs. They reached for empty water skins and trudged towards the moving waters to fill them. Others just slumped onto the ground, digging through packs to devour waybread. The fire was there, but muted, their eyes filled with that semi-vacant stare of expected fatigue. Lano approached the small gathering circle of soldiers. The watchstanders hefted shields to arms and spears in hand. Their attention turned to him as he drew near. "Hail, Marshal!" the watch sergeant called to him. "Winslow?" Lano acknowledged. "How y'all faring?" He looked up at him with a scarred grin. "Just fine, Marshal." "You're not a craven, Winslow. Don't hesitate to tell me or Hannah when you think something is shit. I see a lot, but I don't see everything. The burly mass of a sergeant scoffed as he turned to a soldier some paces off from him. Well, you see, I have this dastardly pain between my legs, but Gunther over here refused to help me relieve it for some reason. You can damn well relieve yourself just fine, you bastard, Gunther shot back. The gathered watchstanders laughed. Lano smiled with them. The burly sergeant turned back to him. Ain't no job ever good, Marshal, but you always take care of us. We always appreciate that. Winslow turned sternly to the other sentries. Ain't that right, boys?
Yes, Sergeant!
The soldiers echoed in a crisply drilled fashion. Lano stared at the whole group of them with an air of amusement. These were the things that he liked to hear, the sights that reassured him. He knew that a grunt could never level with him, and shouldn't, but there were still messages conveyed in roundabout ways. A joke did wonders. Then one bleeding horn blast drew his attention back. The warning cry of the scouting horses echoed from upstream. A flash of thunder shot into Lano's chest as the soldiers nearby jumped to attention. The mercenary marshal turned his horse to the origin of the sound and galloped towards it. He drew quickly towards the river, as it looked to be a detachment of a couple hundred Crescent soldiers approached his army on horseback. 2 long horn blasts ran through the ranks. Lano's troops were a flurry of hard-drilled activity, forming up a shield wall with spears thrust forward. Hannah directed archers behind them from horseback as the mercenary marshal approached them. The lines were still disorganized, but quickly building to a proper formation. "Arrows up!" his second-in-command bellowed. "Hold!" Lano cried out. His second turned to Lano as he drew up beside him. The Crescent soldiers halted some 50 strides from the developing shield wall. One figure separated himself from the rest, moving his mount 10 strides closer to Lano's army. Steel breastplate and bracers covered leather armor, while upon his head was an open, conical-faced steel helmet, festooned with a variety of feathers. He stood with lance and long shield in the midst of the shallow river, clearly demanding a meeting. "Man's a fool," Hannah growled as she eyed the lone cavalryman cautiously. "Or there's a great more numbers in that forest than we think." "Probably the latter," the mercenary marshal replied with an eye to the woods. The lines of his soldiers drew tight into formation, with little additional guidance. They were about as protected as they could hope to be along the open riverbed. The lone Crescent cavalryman continued to wait. Lano sighed. "Spear," he commanded as he dismounted from his horse. Hannah turned a curious eye to her leader as Amund, his young orderly, handed him the weapon. He donned his kite shield onto the other arm. "I'll handle this," he said to her. "Still, be prepared to wreck them if I come running back." With clear misgivings, she still nodded. "Aye, Marshal." His heart thundered in the mercenary leader's chest as he approached the forward shield line. Fear and hazardous anticipation battled for prominence within him as the soldiers cleared a space for him and he passed through it. He could have ridden through on horse, but his fight wasn't with the Crescent, and he didn't want to look like a threat. "Hail, warrior of the Crescent!" Lano called out to him as he drew near. The warrior circled his horse with a scoff. "Dirtying our lands and stealing our water, mercenary!" Lano frowned as the tremble of his heart gave small way to anticipation. The fool was actually looking for a fight. "We're heading westward," he began with the calmest voice he could muster. "Under contract from the Scarlet Matronage. Our fight is not with you." "As if I care for whatever task the matron has sent her wretches to. You're not in her lands. You pass unwanted through the Crescent." "Your master has sworn us safe passage through your land, by word of the matron," the mercenary marshal replied. "I've seen no such writ," he said coldly, "and I've heard no such order." Lano hesitated. It was possible he was telling the truth. The one long blare of another scouting horn filled the air behind him, coming back from the road they had traveled down. That meant him and Hannah's suspicions were confirmed. There were more Crescent soldiers in the woods. He couldn't know how many, but it had to be enough to support the bold action of the mounted warrior. Still, he refused to turn his attention towards it. His eyes remained fixed on the man in front of him. He was what mattered right now. "Say whatever you must," Lano said evenly. "It doesn't change what is true." "Impudent mercenary bastard!" he barked with a sneer. "Do you know how surrounded you are right now? Do you know the fight I could bring to you right now?" Lano paused to take a breath and calm himself. "Are you looking for blood? Perhaps we crossed blades at one time. You can fight with the Clearwater spears after we return." The warrior frowned and went silent. His horse nickered and whined as it stomped in small circles. The detachment of cavalry hung behind him, while the Clearwater spears stood ready at Lano's back. The crescent soldier fixed fiery eyes upon the mercenary leader, but was only met with calm ice. Lano didn't budge. With shield and spear, he stood his ground. "I will give you the personal chance to fight me on my return," he continued evenly, "but you're going to have to wait for it." The warrior snorted. "Haven't you heard? The Scorched Imperator has mages that can shake the very ground. Thardis is no lark. You're not going to return." Lano fought the urge to grin. The Crescent leader knew where they were going. He knew their mission. The man had received the order. He just wanted to ignore it. The mercenary marshal kept his trap shut and continued to stare down the royal, or whatever he was, mounted in front of him. He wasn't going to start the fight, but by rancor he would finish it. The crescent horse continued to circle uneasily. The warrior continued to glare. It was all just aggressive show. The moment passed. The crescent leader snorted and turned back towards his troops at a canter. The company followed behind him, heading back upriver. The threat of the confrontation subsided. Lano relaxed, not having realized he tensed up. With a hard exhale, he headed back towards his army. He marched back through the shield wall and towards his second-in-command. "Handled that better than I would have, Marshal," Hannah said to him. Lano mounted back on his horse and turned to her. "Once the water skins are filled, we're moving out. It's 20 league marches until we're clear of the crescent. I'll give our troops a full day's rest at Darren's Landing to make up for it. Pass the word." "Aye, Marshal." She nodded before turning to the army behind her. "Water up! Heading out!" she cried as she pressed her horse through the ranks. 3 long horn blasts followed with their order. The mercenary leader heard his orders echoed through the various lieutenants. As the shield walls broke formation, Lano cast his eyes to the surrounding forests. It seemed like the matron hadn't quite won over the crescent. He wondered briefly on the long list of other hazards he was likely to encounter along this great march. He turned his attention westward. In about 2 days of even harder marching, they would be clear of these lands. He thought about the yellowed plains, mostly arid this time of year. He thought about Raver, 50 leagues further west than either him or his army had ever been. He thought about the coming battles. Amund, his young orderly, approached him from the ground and handed him a bulging water skin. He took a long draught of it before handing it back. Soon after, the marshal kicked his horse to the head of the slowly organizing column. They would be heading out soon. It was best not to worry about the things that hadn't happened. Those were the unknowable problems of the future. Best to live in the present. It was the coin, it was the task, it was the march. It had started with the fall of the greater patronage of Avallono. It had taken the Scorched Imperator 2 months to achieve that. A year later, he began his hard drive east. In 4 months, he conquered Drystan, Segaroth, Adalona, and Marimor. Then he hit the Gaticanus River and the line of the patronage of Raver. For 4 more months, that line had held. Beyond that, Lano knew very little. 250 leagues obscured a lot of information.
Pay attention, you damn fool!
Back in his quarters, some 6 days now in his past, he sat before the pacing agitation of the matron. She'd agreed to triple his normal fee with very little resistance. It was quite a fortune. Enough to get his army through a year. Maybe even 2 if he played it right. That had worried him. Maybe the situation out west was worse than he thought it was. "What are your plans? And what makes you so sure Raver's about to fall?" he asked. "If the pay is right, and the task is there, what else matters?" "I'm not a starving beast, matron," Lano replied. "And the Clearwater spears haven't lasted as long as we have by rushing into things. How good will your mercenary business be if Thardis conquers everything?" Lano wanted to roll his eyes, but fought the tell. Selflessness was hardly a known trait of the Scarlet Matronage. "Who says they will?" he insisted. "Raver appears to be holding them back pretty well." "I say they will," the matron pressed, "and I'm the one paying you such a high fee for it." "Not yet," Lano replied with a growl. "Don't treat me like a fool or a pushover. I've agreed to nothing, and I'm not one of your vassals." That brought an end to her pacing. The matron turned to confront him. "I'm gonna unite them, Marshal," she said. "The 8 remaining patronages. Not for some pathetic pittance of time, but as something new, something that will last." Disbelief flashed across Lano's face. It wasn't just because of the height of her aspirations, but that she was so forward about it. She actually sounded serious about attempting this unification. This was talk he'd always heard the royals make, but never had anyone done anything with it. The mercenary wanted to laugh at her, but he held back. "That sounds like quite a dream you're pursuing," he argued with a touch of mockery. "My coin and my presence here says that it isn't," she replied sternly. The hard conviction in her voice gave him pause. The crackling of wood burning on the nearby hearth filled the silence between them, as Lano gathered his thoughts. He'd leveraged his position, and she was putting up with it. There was still more there than this. "How bad is it in Raver? What do you know that I don't?" he asked solemnly. "If Raver falls," she continued impatiently, "Karul will likely parley with this new warlord. Everything will fall to pieces. Who will be able to stop him?" "So what?" "I've been 3 days hard riding to get here, Marshal. My forces won't be able to beat the fall rains," the matron persisted. "If you're afraid to do this, just say it. I have the matter of securing the crescent still left, and you're keeping me from it." The details felt useful, but Lano felt that some piece of information was being avoided in this exchange. He didn't know what, as had been lost in where the conversation had gone. He sat quietly and thoughtfully in his chair as the matron returned back to her impatient pacing. The mercenary marshal slowly built the greater picture of things in his mind, as the wood crackled in his fireplace, and the barking command of drilling soldiers floated in from outside. "Are we done? Will you do this, or cower away like a mongrel?" the matron snapped after a time. Lano ignored her. His army was still fat off the job with Teleran, and he had the luxury of saying no. He realized then she hadn't answered his actual questions. Twice. She changed the subject. Her intentions had been stated with the clarity of a practiced speech. She had expected to have to say it. He wanted to know what was beneath it. There was something else driving her. Lano turned a head towards her and spoke, restating the question she hadn't answered. "Answer my questions, or my response remains no. Who says Raver's gonna fall? How bad is it out west? What do you know that I don't?" And there was a fourth question that he left unspoken. Why was she trying so hard to hide it? Lano had known that the true strains of the march would show itself on the yellowed plains. They were a land of dramatic weather shifts from season to season. In the winter, it was bone-biting cold as winds whipped across wide-open plains. In the early spring and fall, the rains came, turning the roads westward into muddy quagmires, while twisting winds made devastating funnel clouds. But from the middle summer to the early fall, those rains ceased altogether. Riverbeds ran dry, and ponds disappeared into the ground. Green grasses turned yellow and brown. The sun burned hot. The land was arid, save for some few far-flung rivers and oases. It was a land of endless flat, an ocean of dirt as far as the eye could see. It was early fall, and any army trying to cross this great swath should have started about a month ago. The land passed behind them with an agonized sloth. One day and one night passed. Another day and another night. Another day. Each day felt almost the same, perhaps just a little bit worse than the previous one. The experience was its own kind of battle. The mercenary marshal had prepared for this as best he could, but there were limits to what could be done. A beast of burden, whether man or horse, could only carry so much water in addition to the usual tools of soldiering. 10 leagues in a day was a strong pace for any army to maintain. 15 was more like punishment. For the infantry, it was a matter of ignoring that painful throbbing in their legs against the constant ground-pulling force of their packs. Errant winds and dancing cyclones cast dust into their face. Rationed water brought a constant thirst at the back of their throat. It was exhaustion, a simple word that constantly gnawed at the back of their mind and influenced their every step. It was a long march, the longest to cross in the shortest time. The columns of 2,000 infantry had gone practically silent by the end of the second day. There was no gnashing or moaning. There were no talks of riches. There was just the persistent rumble of boots grinding into the dirt, of clinking metal armor against the chest. There was just the practice of an army heading westward. The quiet was more a threat than any complaint could ever be. Lano dismounted from his horse at the start of the third day. He lifted a pack to his shoulder and pushed his boots to the ground. With a spear in one arm and shield in the other, he marched at the head of his army. It was a little more than 2 days to Darren's Landing, a small oasis of a pond fed by the seldom few waterways that penetrated the yellowed plains. "You're an idiot, you know that," his second-command commented to him quietly, matching pace beside him on horseback. "An idiot worthy of praise, but an idiot no different. What happens if we're attacked?" Lano gazed up at his second with tired eyes and a tight grimace. "Keep the back moving forward. Keep the scouting horses 3 leagues in front and behind us. When we're a day within the bluffs of Raver, I'll take back to the horse." Hannah stared down at him with clear misgivings, but nodded. "Aye, Marshal." At that order, she kicked her horse into a canter and rode down the column of soldiers. The call went through the ranks ahead of her. "She isn't wrong, Marshal," Winslow said to him after she was gone. "But..." A tired grin rose to the watch sergeant's face. "The troops appreciate it. It ought to help prevent any possible deserters, as long as we don't die." And that was why he did it. There were refugees on the path now, haggard souls carrying sorry burdens and quivering forward with splintered staves. They were sparsely spread, 1 or 3 here or there, young that in the intervening leagues had lost youth, old that lay down to die. The distance they had walked and elements they faced had worked their tragedy on them. Here and there, one of their remains lay by the wayside, abandoned, ignored, and forgotten. They bore words and stories that the mercenary marshal hadn't heard, bought with crusts of whey bread and gulps of precious water. It was as the cavalrymen of the Crescent had said. The scorched imperator rose with mages more powerful than the continent had ever seen. He pressed at openings the reigning patrons had not known existed. Cities burned and people died in the thousands. Roland, the ironwood patron of Raver, had been the only one to halt him. But even now, he faltered. They were broad stories, with little useful information. Wild stories not to be believed in their entirety, but they impressed upon the mercenary marshal the urgency of time. The Clearwater spears fought first for coin, but no coin would be earned if Raver fell. He headed towards a great battle, but the matter that remained in front of him was the march. It continued on with him leading the ranks of infantry. From dawn to the evening, and sometimes later, they carried their burdens across the boundless fields. There was one step in front of the other. It was mark some object in a far view as destination, and as you reached it to mark another one further on. Pack straps bit into shoulders. Feet burned and grounded in slowly faltering boots. Heads drooped down as soldiers sought their rest, legs still carrying onward. The yellow dust of the plains stained the clothes of every soldier. The third day passed from dawn to dusk. The fourth day stretched long and staggering to its end. Winds danced along the tall grass of the boundless plains silently. Soldiers cursed to themselves, and Lono. As the fifth day rose, the promise of a day's rest in Darren's Landing cast a noticeable energy in the army's step. His troops moved faster. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a somewhere closer. Something worth anticipating. Lana watched as his second approached on horseback, kicking up dust at her back at a gallop. Scouts have sighted Darren's Landing about 3 leagues out, she informed him. Coming up on 2 now. Should see it on the edge of the horizon soon. He nodded. They were almost 2/3 of the way there. Just over 100 leagues to Bended Thorn, he said simply. Capital city of Raver. Hannah looked out west with that ever-present grin on her face. Land's pretty, you know. You come this far west so seldom. It's easy to forget that. Lano's initial reaction was to scoff, but he followed her gaze instead. Through his aching exhaustion, he indulged her in trying to see what she saw. The wide expanse of flat stretched before him, so foreign from the forests and hills he knew and typically fought among. In the breath or two he afforded to thinking on it, he saw there was truth to what she said. The march was an easy distraction, but there was something foreign and strangely beautiful to them. Never been to Raver. Wonder what it's like, he said. Hannah grinned down at him, her armor speckled in the yellowy dust of the plains. They have wyverns out there, don't they? Big, blonky flying things that foolhardy people ride. That's what I've heard, though he'd never seen the beasts with his own eyes. Hannah squinted as she turned westward. Looking forward to seeing one of those. Sure the rest of the army is, too. Pass the word. The grin spread wider across her face as her head turned down the long column of trudging soldiers. With relish, she said. Without a further command, she kicked her horse back at a canter as the call ran through the ranks. Darren's Landing had changed markedly since last his army had been there some couple years ago. Refugees crowded the outer edges of the oasis, along the stream that fed the pond and smattering of trees surrounding it. Their ragged tent city stood a safe distance off from the small fort that protected it. Castaway scraps dirtied the surrounding land as the stench of refuge carried on the continuous winds of the yellowed plains. Even still, it was a welcome stop for his army, a chance to rest and recover. As the Clearwater spears settled in, Lano made way to the fort and master's dwelling. The two of them shared a mostly agreeable history, and the mercenary marshal sought provisions to resupply his troops. The prices were double their normal cost, but in line with what he had expected.
Food's gonna be hard to come by until you get to Raver, and even then, who knows? Master Hanif told him. Refugees are flooding the fort towns. Sure you've seen some of it.
The marshal stared out the open doorway of the single-storied stone building. His tired eyes fell on the ranks of homegrown militia, standing shoulder to shoulder at the entryway to the fort. They were there to keep strangers back from the stores of provisions. Beyond that, his army camped, begrudgingly sharing space with maybe twice their numbers in refugees. The cast-asides lorded about between hackneyed tents with empty eyes and sunken faces. Lano had seen living people in worse states, but not a lot worse.
Sorry times we're in that double a normal price feels like a favor, he commented. The master nodded acknowledgement. It only gets worse the further west you go. Scorched imperators truly wrecking the west. I haven't seen the like in my lifetime. I promise you that.
Lano turned back towards him.
I'll take whatever you can offer,
he said, placing a bag of silver on the table between them. The master grinned.
I'm gambling on you, Lano, and the matron for that matter. Just make sure to return the favor if everything doesn't fall to oblivion.
The mercenary marshal grimaced back at him and scoffed.
Aye.
Their time in Darren's Landing came and went in what felt like a blink. The day passed, and the march went on. The vastness of the land of Karul continued to drag in front of them. Yellow grasses danced under endless skies. Soldiers' feet ground red and raw as one league passed, and then another. Eyes the same. The plains were ever dry, the winds ever relentless. But the heat of the plains was faltering, giving way to a chill that burst harshly in the evenings. Lano eyed the sky above warily, noting how the clouds gathered. The fall rains were coming soon. Lano and Taurus continued to march at the head of the column with his troops, feeling the same suffering they endured. He suffered through the pack straps that bit into his shoulders. He suffered through the constant, gnawing ache of his straining legs. He pushed fiercely back against the plain exhaustion that muddied his mind and commanded him to slumber. His thoughts ever ran to Raver and the task he had taken on. This was what he had to do, and that was it. There wasn't space for much else. The dawn to dusk marches went on. As the Clearwater spears drew closer to Raver, the raw destruction of Thardis and the scorched Imperator began to show itself more clearly. It showed in the shuddering masses of refugees. It showed in the stories they told. They were in much greater numbers now. A long line of the elderly, children, and the too rare young man or woman to guide them eastward. They stretched in uneven groups from one horizon to another, with rarely a hill or tree to hide their numbers. The occasional fortunate one had a pack animal to drag a hollowed cart or carry a fallen family member, but most moved onward on foot. The masses of abandoned dead grew along their path. Starving men, women, and children moaned with outstretched hands towards them. Soldiers shared rations where they could, as the army continued westward past them. The march went on, as the clouds continued to gather above. The silence of his soldiers was a dark sign. Moaning and protest took energy that they didn't have. Instead, the exhaustion dramatically shortened the path to conflicts within the rank and file. Bouts of anger showed themselves in flash exchanges of fiery rage. Battling people exchanging fists over petty things. A fellow soldier marched too slowly. Another one was not doing their fair share of work. Han and his lieutenants quelled them as they rose up and down the lines of infantry. Still, such flare-ups showed themselves as the army laid down in the evenings and rose before the dawns. They were not unexpected, but they were still dangerous. Once the problem was large enough to call a halt, Lano and Taurus ditched his pack and thundered through the lines to confront them. "By Rancor!" he roared, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Are you a Clearwater spear or are you some pathetic conscript?" The exhausted, sullen eyes of whatever soldier stared hot confrontation at the marshal, but remained silent. He drew himself up closer, practically breathing down the face of the leader of the quarrel. "I know this is shit, but it's ours! Fantastic coin comes at the end of this. I carry this weight the same as yours. Are you saying you can't handle this?" "No, Marshal." "Louder!" he barked. "No, Marshal!" He nodded sternly. "We still have many leagues to cover, and you're keeping us from it. Back to the line!" The conflict had ended there, but the mercenary marshal doubted it was the end of it. He knew what they were going through. He knew the strain. The cracks were there, and the only thing that would mend them was their arrival in Raver. Karul continued to stretch before them. The march went on. A day passed, and then another. The fort towns they passed were as the master of Darren's Landing had described them. Greater numbers of sorry people crowded outside tall stone walls. The fort's militias took to violence to keep the starving masses at bay. Fresh mounds of the buried dead lay unmarked along the roads. The Clearwater spears passed them with exhausted indifference. Dark clouds were gathering in the sky as colder winds blew across the plains. The fall rains were coming. Another day drew to a close. It was late evening, 2 days after the matron had departed his quarters, 2 days after Lano had accepted her task. Alone in his room, a glow shard cast its pale light on the table before him from a lantern sconce. With quill and ink he sat before a ledger, bearing tallies of his units and supplies. Out beyond the walls of his fort, a tent town had risen up of every soldier he could muster. The field in front was lit up like its own city, with hundreds of bright beads of orange light against the darkness. The mercenary marshal cast an eye to the open window, the galloping sound of approaching hoofbeat. He heard the sentry guard challenge them, and the herald announce her arrival. A brief time further, he could hear his second stomping boots mounting the stairs to his quarters. She burst through the door in hood and full armor, with a familiar bright grin plastered to her face. "Donker's Commonage released their horses. Wasn't too happy about the time frame, but he's managing. Fastest beast east will be at her beck and call in the morning." She practically laughed. Lano nodded as he made a count of it in the book before him with quill and ink. "That's good. At least we've covered in the people side of it." Hannah reached for a decanter sitting on the far corner of the table. "I've always appreciated the pitcher of burr wine you keep," she observed, "even though you don't drink yourself." She filled a nearby cup and took a deep draught of it before filling another one. She glanced over the large book sitting on the table between them. "How's the practical side of the job looking?" she asked. Lano sat back in his chair with wary eyes and a sigh. "I'm concerned about food. We should have enough supplies to get us most of the way to Raver, but we're going to have to restock somewhere along the way. Not sure how reliable that's going to be." "Would 2 more days have made a difference?" The marshal nodded. "Yes. Then there's the fall rains. What's worse, a slog through mud, or having easier footing with a hungry army?" Hannah turned an eye westward, taking another deep drink of wine. "Pay's good, but it's still a shit job. What makes you believe we can maintain 15 leagues a day?" "Because we're the best mercenary band east of the Gatticanas. Because I said so." She snorted at that statement, turning a disbelieving eye to him. "Be honest, Lano. What magic the mage and Seraphina have to work to get you to agree to this?" "There's a lot to that woman. A lot more than I reckoned," he said, drawing himself back up in his chair. "She's committed this whole endeavor in a way I didn't expect. If we fail, she fails completely. It's rare, and that means something." Hannah bent in close with a knowing smirk on her face. You know, there's this story between the two of them, her and Roland, she began. Just whispers and gossip, really. It's the stuff of romantic ballads. Kind of story that makes the heart swoon if it's true. You heard anything on that? A soft, amused grin rose to the marshal's face, but he added nothing to it. Hannah chuckled. Lano, you smile so rarely. You know that's a tell, right? Might as well just give me the whole story. The grin disappeared from his face as he turned to her half sternly. If I hear any real discussions among the troops about this, there's gonna be a reckoning, Hannah. A stranger might have been threatened by those words, but him and Hannah had been together since practically the beginning. The grin across her face only broadened. My lips are sealed, but you can't stop me from thinking about it. Why would I want to hold you back from your own private swooning? She chuckled a little more before turning serious. Early morning tomorrow. I'm sore. I'm gonna put in for the night. Try to get some sleep, Lano. The saddle's a bad place to do it. There was truth in what she said, and Lano knew it. Still, he just raised his mug of tea to her as a toast. You do yours, I do mine. Have a good night. Hannah took her leave of him with a nod, closing the door behind her. Lano dropped his wary head to his hand with a sigh. His eyes ran over the ledger briefly, before turning to the map behind him. He thought about Hannah's words, and he also thought about the matron. He thought about the task laid before them. It was shit. Even at triple pay, he could see why the other mercenary bands had turned her down. The matron had been right about him. He'd always cared more about coin than country. It was safer that way. Royals like to lie, and it kept you out of bad circumstances. But this did feel different. Something for in his heart stirred. It felt like this whole endeavor just might be honest. And maybe, just maybe, he cared about it. They were about 30 leagues out from Raver. It was another 20 leagues or so to Bended Thorn, its capital city. Lano and his army of 2,500 came to rest on a small patch of raised ground. Drizzling rain fell from the sky as the fall winds buffeted them. Night had long since fallen, and still they were set to leave before daybreak. Still torches burned and sizzled in the evening darkness, illuminating a space surrounded by his soldiers. There remained harsh business to be tended to. Lano stood at attention on wavering legs that he made every attempt to hide. The firelight whipped and sputtered in the opening air. His hand rested atop the pommel of his sheathed blade, lightly shaking against the fall cold. Hannah stood cautiously at his side. He had hoped to avoid having to do something like this. The jailers led the deserters forward into the circle, covered on either side by sword and spearmen. The prisoners' heads were hung low, hands bound, clothes torn to almost tatters. Some 50 or so total had made to flee, but the 6 placed before him had been judged to have organized it. The surrounding circle was quiet. The lit torches sputtered fitfully in the wind. Lano approached the leader of the small band, eyes fixed upon him. Do you have any final words? The young man lifted his head to Lano's eyes, full of a sudden fire. His voice rose like a tidal wave. This is a hopeless cause! Serafina doesn't care or expect us to live! There's no... His words were cut off abruptly by the knee that shot into his stomach, and a fist that struck down upon his head. Lano stood over the collapsed figure, fist clenched, eyes seething in rage. Raise him up, jailers. He's said enough. The 2 jailers came to either side of him. He struggled initially, rising up to try and bolt. Strong arms caught him and shoved him to the ground. He wrestled for a time before one of the jailers struck him on the head, forcing him down onto his knees, his head on the block. Lano unsheathed his blade, slowly raising it up so that all within range could witness. He held it there for some breaths. The man began to cry. "Don't. Please, don't." Lano struck down swiftly. The young man's head tumbled away from his body, his voice silenced. Lano wiped the blood from his blade and sheathed it. With a heavy sigh, he gestured to the waiting soldiers. The act was done. The jailers carried the body away. The other 5 were pulled off to the sides, spread out through the ranks to be made examples of. They would be punished at his lieutenant's discretion and returned to the lines. In Lano's mind, they'd been paid to kill the matron's enemy, and not each other. It wasn't what he wanted to do, but it was what he had to do. And right now, the fatigue of his own decision added fuel to a fire roaring within him. He had marched with them. He had witnessed their shit the same as any low-tiered grunt. He had suffered with them at every turn. The desertion was not an offense against the matron Serafina and the job she had laid them on. This was an offense against him, and he would not tolerate it. His eyes ran back and forth around the circle of soldiers, pacing with legs that moved with the fury of newfound energy. And fed by that, he roared. "Now listen well, you dirt-spewing mongrels!" he barked to the assembled. "We've come over 200 leagues in 15 days! We've endured distance and suffering that would make any of these conscripted patronage knob-knockers keel over and die like the pathetic pieces of shit that they are! By the dragon gods, I am proud of most of you!" His voice was like a thunderclap. His motions were jerking back and forth of unrepentant fury. 50 leagues to our end, and you fail me now? This is not about the coin we are paid or the shit of this venture before us. It is about the task. The Clearwater Spear is a place for fighters and destroyers. We finish what we start. Nations quiver and piss their pants as we march to war with them. And that is because we endure where so many others fall. No one runs. No one quits. This horseshit is not going to happen again. Do you understand? The response was muted, exhausted acknowledgments running through the ranks. A further epithet rose to his lips, but he halted in the moments that his eyes ran over his company. Their clothes were dusty yellow, sweat-stained, helmets hung loosely on muddled packs and boots falling to pieces. They stared in his direction with that vacant exhaustion that he knew well. There was also the edge of impatience. Few stood where they were, and even those sitting stared away, to nearby tents and empty patches of ground. They didn't care. Rest was more value for them than any example being made. They'd come this far together. The real army wasn't going to break. They weren't going to run. He was wasting their time. Lano's chest rose with a barely perceptible grin of pride. They just might make it, though he wondered how well they would fight. There was one problem at a time, though. The fall rains would only make the westward travel worse. They needed to get to the bluffs and forests of Raver first. His voice eased. His words changed. "Daybreak will come!" he yelled so that all could hear it. "The march continues on. We will give this scorched imperator cause to fear the east. He knows not the shit he has unleashed. Take your rest. I'm finished." Soldiers sauntered off to their tents. Sentries stood their rotation watches. Most of the torches were snuffed out. Hannah eyed him solemnly as he turned towards her. "Orders?" she asked. "We'll do a late start tomorrow," he sighed. "No breaking down camp till daybreak. Don't pass the word, though. Let it be a welcome surprise. It's about all that I dare to afford." A tired grin rose to her face. "We're close, Lano," she said quietly. "You done punishing yourself and ready to go back to the horse?" The mercenary marshal again felt the pains of his westward trek, the plain exhaustion of the march. He wanted desperately to sleep, but still turned his head towards Raver. It was as he had said, beyond coin or country, it was the matter of completing the task. Maybe it was something more for once. "One more day," he replied firmly, "and we blast through Bended Thorn. I'll sleep for a whole week." Her grin stretched wider in defeat as she followed his eyes toward Raver. "Aye, Marshal," she said, as clear fatigue shone in her face and in her voice. She headed back towards her tent as the start of the fall rains continued around them.
And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the story. I will acknowledge there wasn't a whole lot of action in that story. It's a lot of character building and establishment of the baseline and everything like that. But I promise there's a ton of action in the upcoming parts. A lot of death and war and heroism and all that other good stuff. Really, what I hope that landed really, really well was the variation of these characters and how much of an internal struggle it is to figure out what exactly is the right thing to do in any kind of situation. But that being said, let's move on to the credits for all the different artists whose contributions I do greatly appreciate, and we'll kind of go from there. So for this story, I have 6 artists that I will introduce and 3 musicians. And we will kind of move on from there. So first on the list is this freaking fantastic person. This is adrianorizza. He's one of my regulars that I picked up off of Fiverr. Really talented artist. He's actually one of the early people that I came across while plunging through Fiverr, and he's really talented. And he's at a price point that I can afford, and I really liked him for it. And he's been very, very, very good to work with. He has an Instagram at adrianorizza.art at Instagram, and an ArtStation as well at adrianorizza.artstation.com. Go check him out. He's really good. He really likes to draw monsters. I'm gonna try to get him some more monsters, but we'll go from there. Because not everything I have has monsters. Anyway, second person on the list is ATMRLV_art. You can find him out on Fiverr. He also has an Instagram under the same title. He's pretty much my go-to landscape artist because he has a cool style to his landscaping, so it adds a little diversity, and he's really pleasant to work with, and I really enjoy just working with him in general. And once again, I'm pretty sure he's a art student out of Russia, so go support his work. He's really, really good. He's got a good fantasy touch to him, I love him. Number 3 on the list is going to be the guy who did this. And he was a title placard, and his name is joanbelda. I believe he's out of Spain. He has an Instagram too. You can find it under j.bm.88 at Instagram. He's really cool because he does a cool Art Nouveau style, and I personally love Art Nouveau. And he's been really, really good to work with, especially once he saw the first episode of the YouTube channel that I've kind of put together. Anyway, moving on, number 4 is my general favorite, and I'll fucking admit that he's my general favorite, is gonna be, that's Varyson. He's also on Fiverr. You can find him. He also has an Instagram. He's admitted to me that he doesn't have much on that Instagram, but it's a great place to go and talk to him or anything like that, especially engaging with his art. He's very talented, not a native speaker, but I really like working with him, and I really like the art that he's given me. It's been pretty fantastic. Anyway, his Instagram is varyson.art at Instagram. Number 5 on the list is perhaps what I would say the best customer service that I've ever received from an artist on Fiverr, and that is mayolodraws. And if I bastardize that, I apologize. I believe she's out of the Philippines. She's very professional, very honest. She knows the right questions to ask, and she, could have, pumped me for a premium, but she gave me a standard, and I really appreciate her honesty. And if I have any kind of background stuff to kind of work with, I would easily go back to her. She was really good to work with, and she really knew what she was doing. And that's kind of what I would say about that end. Moving on to number 6. I have the person who did the map, which is this thing. And he works out only on Fiverr. He was very, very professional. I had some problems kind of getting the maps together with a couple other people, and when I landed on him, he was extremely professional. took all of my change requests without, with minimal difficulties, and was really, really good to work with. And he's out of the UK, and I'm sorry I totally didn't get his name. His name is SNIKT5 at Fiverr. And yeah, definitely go check him out if you need a good fantasy map, because he was good to work with. Moving on, I have the musicians, which really haven't changed, but here they are again because they're freaking great. First person is Rayanuk. He's on Fiverr, and his songs were this. And he's currently taking a hiatus, and I really hope he comes off that hiatus so that I can start getting some other music out of him, because he's really good customer service, and he's got a hell of a lot of talent, and I do really, really like him. Second person on the list is going to be the other mainstay that I have with musicians, and that's this guy. And that is the_Vicken. Also has an Instagram. It's the Vicken Studios at Instagram, and still remains the best customer service that I've ever encountered with musicians. Solidly talented, pleasant to work with, absolutely makes any kind of changes at the slightest request whatsoever. He's just nice. How important it is to just be someone that is so incredibly nice. And it's great to work with him. So that's what I'm gonna say on that end. Third person, which I missed last time, I'm trying to correct it right now. He's the one who did the main theme, that jazzy undertone that should be playing right now. He's also out of Argentina, so I guess, Argentinians have this, great aptitude for, classical music in some fashion or another, but super duper talented, very easy to work with. His name is Franco_Donadio. He also has a SoundCloud. It's going to be soundcloud.com/Franco-Donadio. And I think that pretty much covers everything that needs to be said. Oh yeah, sorry, one other thing is I also have an Instagram, which you can find me at Pablo Americanus at Instagram. I really have nothing posted up there, but it's a great place to engage with me if you have any questions, you want to give me any kind of critiques. I always appreciate good, thoughtful critiques, and believe me, I will take them under any, thoughtful considerations. But yeah, that's about it. And yeah, to that end, I offer a toast. Salud. Delicious.